All right, so JC wants to know what is the common consensus about addicts in prison? There seems to be a hierarchy of inmates who are respected for both avoiding and indulging in narcotics.
It depends on who you ask. If you're asking the individuals, like if you go back to the 70s, pretty much everybody was engaged in some form of substance use. Heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, hallucinogenics, pretty much everyone. And that for me was one of the issues, is that you had tens of thousands of dollars going toward supporting that substance use, when, in my opinion, if you were going to have a business, those revenues would be better served towards developing the infrastructure of the gang itself as a business. So there are many who abide by the rule, if you will, that substance use affects one's thinking and demeanor and emotions, and as such is a negative as it relates to being able to function in the capacity of a warrior.
Riker has asked what you think of Troy Kell.
I've heard the name, but I don't know Troy Kell. There are a lot of people I don't know. Actually, the truth be told, there are a lot of people I know by sight, but couldn't tell you their name. So no, I've heard the name, but beyond that, I simply don't know.
All right, so Colin Mason has asked, did you have any positive or negative interactions with any members of La Cosa Nostra?
Well, again, context is important. I mean, Sal was with the Italians out of LA, but Sal was actually Joe Morgan's connection. And, Joe Morgan was a leader of the Mexican mafia at the time, and Joe and I were good friends. But his connections came out of Las Vegas, and that was really the basis for his control of the Mexican mafia, was his ability to generate revenues through his connections. And Sal was one of them, and I had some association with Sal, in that context. Beyond that, not personally, and by that I mean personal contact with. We provided protection. And when I say we, I'm talking about the brand, provided protection to a number of individuals who were made members of the Italian mafia. Most of that occurred within the federal system, John Gotti being probably the most famous amongst those individuals.
How would that have worked then? How would John Gotti have established that?
It was simply a matter of not having his own people, enough of his own people present to provide protection for him, so that if there were other individuals within that system that were attempting to extort John Gotti in any capacity, then he did not have a power base within the prison itself representing his own individuals that could protect him. And so then you go to the power base that does exist, and in this case, it's the Aryan Brotherhood, and you negotiate terms relative to providing protection.
So was money transferred over from his organization to your organization?
It isn't so much from his organization, although it could be said, but more so from John Gotti himself or any other individual in that capacity. Whether or not his organization provided that funding, I couldn't tell you, and actually don't know.
Okay, so Lee Benevento has asked, was the military ever an option to possibly have avoided all of this?
I wish it would have been. I actually attempted to enlist back in the 60s during the Vietnam War, and was denied because I'm colorblind. I have one of the rarest forms of colored blindness. I don't see any color at all. And so the problem with that is that insignias and uniforms and the like. There's no such thing as camouflage to me. Um, so I can't distinguish. Although, colored blind individuals during World War II were used as snipers precisely because there was no such thing as camouflage. But in my case, when I attempted to enlist, and I tried every organization, Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force, even the Coast Guard, and was declined because of my color blindness. So, yes, I wish that would have been an option.
I mean, just looking at that question, though, he's saying about avoiding all of this. So you were in an environment of extreme violence, but perhaps the only other environment of more extreme violence could have been these battles of Vietnam. So that could possibly have ended in even more violence in your world.
Well, it's true. I mean, it's a valid point that you're making. You see, but what you want to remember is that the one form of violence that you're talking about relative to Vietnam and otherwise is sanctioned. It's sanctioned by our government. And as such, they actually train the individuals that are engaged in that violence for that very violence. And personally, I don't have a problem with that. Never have had. When you're at war, when you're representing the interests of this country, and then I'm a patriot. I believe in that, and attempted to enlist and engage in warfare on behalf of this country. Even though Vietnam was only a police action, I'm not going to get into the politics of that. But I know that the Vietnam veterans that came back to this country after that police action were not treated well. And that I still to this day deal with a lot of Vietnam vets who suffer the trauma of that through my counseling and, PTSD and everything else associated with it.
Yeah, more than half of my friends in Arizona prison were former veterans,
Mm.
and a lot of them came back traumatized, didn't get the help, ended up on street drugs to self-medicate,
Hmm.
and then just drifted in and out of the prison system. It was really sad.
Yes, it is. For those who choose in this day and age to be homeless, and many people do, I don't have a problem with that. Um, People make analogies by way of hobos or the like, used to travel by train and during the Depression and the Dust Bowl and that whole situation. So for those who are homeless and choose that, even if that's by virtue of addiction, that choice, that's one thing. I think what upsets me is when I see veterans who cannot get help for their PTSD and end up homeless on the street without help. Now, it isn't to say that you don't have many organizations that are attempting to assist veterans. You do. But the very idea that you have an individual that comes back from warfare and cannot cope and ends up on the street, in the gutter, or otherwise because of that, then I think that's a shame.
Do you think that could have possibly happened to you then if you had been accepted? Because people see you as somebody that's calm, cool, and collective under pressure and has, survived this extremely deadly environment. But on other occasions, when we've asked you about your trauma, you've
Mm-hmm.
said it was internalized and you have PTSD to this day. So
Mm-hmm.
perhaps if you're in the thick of the gore in Vietnam, you could have ended on some bad trajectory like these other poor people that came back.
It's yes. The thing to what you're really acknowledging there is that I'm human, and in that I am just as susceptible as anyone else to that. I had the blessing of having been exposed to innumerable catastrophic events um, during my life when I was younger, prior to coming to prison, and I think it was that assisted me in coping with that which I had to confront in surviving prison. It makes a difference, that my training, my spirituality, all those factors come into play. So how that would have played out had I gone to war on behalf of this country is anyone's guess. The It's like apples and oranges, really, if you think about it. Um, I'm not going to put myself on the same level as a veteran who's gone to war on behalf of this country or any other country, for that matter. I believe that would be disingenuous. And so I think that distinction is necessary. But had I done that, could I have been susceptible? Absolutely.
Nermin, how was the Aryan Brotherhood involved with Charlottesville?
I don't know that they were. Um,
What was Charlottesville for the viewers who don't know?
well, Charlottesville is where you had the white supremacists. Um, if I'm understanding the question correctly, but you have essentially hate groups and an individual who took it upon himself to kill others, murder others in a church. If I don't have the right situation here, let me know. The thing that you want to remember about me is that I don't have access to the internet, so I'm not allowed to watch the news feeds. I get all my information secondhand, and I do try to stay abreast of the so-called hate groups, the white supremacists. The idea of domestic terrorism and what that means. It's one of the things that I am going to be addressing on my podcast because I think it's relevant to our contemporary society. And, the positions that we as Americans take relative to violence and racism and hate. And I think a dialogue needs to be generated that is meaningful.
So I've got access to the internet. It says here the Charlottesville car attack was a supremacist attack on August 12, 2017.
Oh, yes, okay. That's where he drove into the crowd?
Drove his car into a crowd of people peacefully
yeah.
protesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember that. I actually had that confused with a march that occurred, and then another individual, like I said, going into a church and taking the life of a number of individuals. In this particular instance, the car issue is unfortunately not surprising in this day and age. Did the brand have anything to do with that? No, I doubt it very seriously. But, how do you make that distinction? When you set aside the name or the label, brand, Aryan Brotherhood, Poor Boys, whatever it may be, when you set aside the labels, what are you dealing with? You're dealing with individuals who hate and are radicalizing younger individuals toward perpetrating violence against other individuals. In this case, it was a car. To my way of thinking, that's an amazingly cowardly thing to do. Under any context. So, but no, I don't believe the brand was involved with that. Was that individual radicalized by a hate group? I believe so.
Well, he ended up getting life plus 419 years.
Mm-hmm.
He pled guilty to 29 of 30 federal hate crime charges to avoid the death penalty,
Yeah.
which resulted in another life sentence handed down in June 2019. Wow. And he injured 35 people. He killed one. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So Ron Swanson has asked whether Charles Manson was a pedophile.
Yes. Short answer, yes. And I have the experience of having partially witnessed that and took action to stop it and did. And indeed, I took action to stop his visits for that reason. But yeah, no question about it.
Is that did he have minors visiting? Was that
he had females visiting him who brought their children in for that reason. And So, for me, the only thing to do in a situation like that is to put a stop to it.
We've got another question that ties into this from MYT. Hey, Mike, just wanted to ask you to tell us more stories about Manson. Some of the things that was said and done, you served 10 years with Charlie, has to be some stuff going on when Manson is around. He was a one-of-a-kind character. I don't agree with all of his deeds or decisions, but do you have any Manson stories you haven't told us yet?
Well, probably a ton. My concern is this, is that I do not wish to perpetuate the myth of Charlie Manson. The media created Charlie relative to, the type of person that he was and otherwise. I can tell you that I attempted numerous times to conduct, at his request, ceremony with him and spiritual ceremony, and did do that. Whether or not that impacted him is hard to say. I set up a nonprofit organization for him that was environmentally based, did a number of things for him. There were others who used his memorabilia and sold it, and I don't take issue with that. That's their prerogative, as far as I'm concerned. But it's the myth itself associated with Charlie that I object to. I never had that with Sirhan Sirhan, although by my estimation, an extreme narcissist. But again, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and for me to make that contention is really unfair. But I do have 10 years of experience with both Charlie and Sirhan Sirhan. And so by way of my own observation, and that's what I mean by observation when I use it in my podcast, is I'm going to be making observations and ask others to make their observations. But I prefer that they make those observations based on their experiences, not their feelings. Too often, I think what happens, Sean, is that what people feel or what they think is a fact, and it's not. They're entitled to feel whatever they do and think whatever they do, but that does not make it a fact.
And the other thing is memory is malleable.
Say that again?
Memory is malleable.
It is. And I suppose that's the thing to remember about the blessing of our brains, and particularly by way of example, when you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with a fragmented memory that holds itself within the medial cortex of the brain. And that's the whole idea behind the fight, flight, freeze characteristic, is that it accesses that fragmented memory. So when something feels the same, we react accordingly, even though it may not be the same. So that can be changed. And that goes to your contention. By addressing the trauma itself, its origins, and you can actually facilitate the growth of new memories.
And it's also why witness testimony is so unreliable sometimes.
I would agree. We see that time and time again, and what's relied upon, relative to that. Unfortunately, particularly in the case of Black men, African American men. I have the personal experience of having been behind the iron gates with individuals who are African American, and some I helped in their law cases, but oftentimes their treatment by way of lineup and witnesses testifying against them were just absurd. I mean, where the assailant was supposed to be 6'2" and this guy's 5'3", and had an afro and this guy's head shaved, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, he was black. That was good enough, and they went with it.
Next one. What are your thoughts on Rikers Island Prison, New York?
Don't know too much about it, other than the reputation that it's a force to be reckoned with. That it's hard time.
Mark wants to know, how well did you know Tommy Silverstein?
Not well. I knew Tommy, and we communicated, but Tommy, after he killed the federal guard, went into essentially no man's land. He was kept on no human contact for years. And, you've seen that movie, I think, what is it, to Hannibal Lecter? And his living circumstances weren't far off from that. He lived in a glass cage, and he had no human contact. So I was able to talk to an investigator that went to see him and talk to him. And I think much of what Tommy was living and experiencing is expressed in his artwork. I don't know if you've seen his artwork. I don't even know if it's available, but I have. And it's dark, extremely dark. But, Tommy was a warrior. And I did not agree with what he did. And, but that's irrelevant.
Cindy wants to know, was the brand started for revenge?
It's a good question, but if you mean revenge in the sense that the white population was being preyed upon by other races, and so revenge in that context, that could be said. Really, what happened was, you're going back to the late 60s and the Bluebirds and the Diamond Tooth. And so you had essentially other groups like neo-Nazis who were inciting. And in that, the white population was being retaliated against by the black population. And so the Aryan Brotherhood stepped up, essentially, to take control of that and to ensure that the white population would no longer be preyed upon by the black population.
Okay, next question is, have you seen Blood In, Blood Out?
I haven't, no. It had been suggested to me, and I may do this, that I watch these prison movies and critique them as to their authenticity. So I think I probably will be doing that. I think it may have value. Too often, I think what happens is that Hollywood gets carried away. And if you're going to deal with stories, particularly that are based on true life events, then I believe authenticity is critical. And that's actually where they got in trouble with making American Me, is that they deviated from that authenticity, and it was very costly to a number of people who lost their life as a result of it.
Well, I would love to see you critique those movies, Mike, and please put Shot Caller near the top of that list.
I'll do that, Sean.
We've got, what is your opinion on female prison guards? Is a male prison a suitable place for female workers?
I think it makes it difficult. I understand, the rights associated with a female guard working a men's prison, just like men work a female's prison. And I understand it. It's the uniform is supposed to eliminate gender, but in fact it does not. So it creates a lot of problems. Where I'd really like to see women within the prison system working is in administrative positions, power positions, people in authority who are making decisions about the programs and what's going on in the prison and what needs to be done. Walking the line as a guard is an entirely different matter. The current Secretary of Corrections, that's the leader of the Department of Corrections here in California, Miss Allison, started off as a medical technician, and she advanced, through the ranks to become now the Secretary of Corrections. She was a warden. She held many positions, but I think one of the things that makes her so effective is the origins of her beginning as a medical technician. Being in a position of having to administer to prisoners medically and seeing that firsthand, and then moving beyond that to evolve in the various positions that she held. So to walk the line creates problems. You have men who have not seen women. And so when you have a woman guard, it's just the mere fact that they know it's a woman. They'll masturbate in front of her. It becomes extremely lewd. And, that creates its own problems because, and the reason it does is this, is that the men guards take the position that that's another guard that's now been disrespected. So what it does is it facilitates that person having disrespected this female guard by masturbating in front of her. They'll now come in and they'll put hands on this individual, sometimes quite severely. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't called for, but it's contrary to their code of ethics, and as such, illegal. So those are the kind of problems that are created.
Andy wants to know, with a name like Thompson, do you have any Scottish roots?
I do. You can look at the Thompson clan as mercenaries. As a matter of fact, they were mercenaries for the Williams clan. And there's a significant history there that I'm not unaware of. I embrace my heritage on every level, at least to the point where it's available to me. I was raised Native, and the issue has come up as to whether or not I am Native. But it's just like this one book here. I don't know if you can see it or not. Let's try it.
Yes.
Okay, that's my Aunt Lucy. Okay, she's Yurok here in California. She was married to my Uncle Milton, who was Anishinaabe. And that book is to the American Indian. And, I learned a lot from her, as well my uncle. So, I have an Irish heritage, I have a Scottish heritage, and I honor them both. I look at the similarities, actually, especially as it relates to spirituality involved. If you go pre-Christian, then you're dealing with the Druids. But, even in that, you're dealing with a different characteristic as to the spirituality and not as merchants of gold. They had sweat lodges, for instance. They were built of stone like beehives, but they were sweat lodges nonetheless. And they had a connection, spirit-wise, to nature. And so very, very common characteristics associated with the two. I tell people all the time that in lodge ceremony that I've walked with my ancestors. And I'm not talking about Native American ancestors. I'm talking about ancestors. There's been times when I've looked through the fire and been able to see my ancestors dance. I used to sing songs, oftentimes that other Native men that were present would say, well, that doesn't sound Native. And I'd say, well, that's because its origins are Irish or Scottish, relative to that. But the essence of a song is a prayer in that, and who you're praying for. I brought individuals into the lodge that were Christian, and they would pray to Jesus inside the lodge, and I'd have another Native say, well, hey, he's praying to Jesus. And I say, well, do you think Jesus doesn't hear him? Of course he does. He just happens to be using the lodge to facilitate that. And I think that's true of anything that we do. Everything has a voice. Everything has a spirit. And I honestly believe that if you open your heart to that spirit, it can and will speak to you.
Barry's wondering how you did 45 years without going crazy.
It's an often asked question. And it's a relative term, crazy or insane. But to answer your question, my spirituality, by staying connected to my way of life. I've made my rattles out of grapefruit rind, and I've had In my cell at one time, I had as many as 40 mice. And in one place, I had ferrets that used to hunt gophers and bring them to me. So it's about relationship. Um, I've had scorpions and snakes, that I've had relationship with. Much better relationships that I actually had with human beings. Until I got to that point where I was allowed to attend my lodge ceremonies. And, that created a whole different dynamic. But that too was a connection to my way of life. And that is the source and remains the source, actually, of my sanity as well as my humanity.
Yeah, I mean, living with the cockroaches in Sheriff Joe Arpaio's jail was one of the parts that drove me the craziest.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was in that building for 14 months,
Mm.
I had to learn to live in harmony with my new cellmates.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why when, I think it's in part 1 or part 2 of this series review, Mike, you said you even went to naming the cockroaches, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It was one of those situations where they were going to eat the food off my face. It was inevitable. There was nothing I could do because I had been shot and I couldn't lift my arms. So I felt them crawling up my body, and they came up out of the hole in the floor, which was a sewer. And they were approximately 3 inches long and had these just enormous antennae. So you could feel those antennae feeling their way up your body. And I did. Initially when they did that, because I had food all over my face, I attempted to dislodge them, by blowing air out my lips through at them. And it didn't work. All they would do is hiss. They make this like rattling sound. And so I said, well, okay. So I named the first one Herman, and pretty soon he was bringing friends to the table, and I named those too. So to me, that was the best way to join them.
I'll never forget that rustling sound because on my bunk, they were just inches away from my face. When you turn over in your sleep, making that rustling sound, and then the movement, and that's kind of like this musky metallic smell.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's I understand it, but cockroaches are really no different. I think the thing that concerned me was that, like I said, they came up out of the sewer. And I thought, okay, what's that going to do to me by way of infection or otherwise? But since there was nothing I could do about it, I stopped worrying about it.
You just have to accept it, don't you? Because they do carry a whole plethora of pathogens.
They do.
Do you think that those conditions have created a more robust immune system for you?
I think it must have. When you look at that, although I was just early this morning contemplating the idea of my immune system in relationship to the very thing that you're talking about. Because I lived in isolation for decades, and as such was not really subject to a lot of diseases other than like we're talking about now. And that would be hepatitis if it occurred at all, as a result of the fecal matter associated with the cockroaches. But I think that in many ways, in living in isolation the way I did, that I didn't contract a lot of sickness or poor health or otherwise. I mean, I'm a firm believer in supplements. One of my mentors was Linus Pauling, who wrote some excellent books on vitamin C. He was an advocate of vitamin C. I take mega doses of it every day. And I believe in it. It's the only vitamin that our body doesn't produce. It goes a long way. It's now recognized with this COVID pandemic that vitamin C is critical, along with zinc and vitamin D, towards boosting our immune system. And so, it has real value.
There was a hepatitis C epidemic where I was housed, and up to 2/3 of the fellas had it. Primarily from sharing needles, drug intravenous drug use or
Yeah.
tattooing.
Yeah.
Did you, because there was a period of time when people weren't aware that it was spreading, did you become aware at such a point and take measures to avoid, for example, from tattoos or knife fights, the worry that there could have been exchange of blood?
It wasn't so much the exchange of blood, but oftentimes men fought with knives that had been laced with poison. And so that if they cut you, then, that was going to have a real impact. So the production of poison is not that difficult behind the iron gates. It's like anything else. It's just a matter, there's a learning curve as it relates to anything. When I learned how to beat metal detectors, that was as a result of my education pertaining to physics. And, the same is true. I'm a biologist by training. That's what I pursued, and that's what I became. And so, you're dealing with organic chemistry and chemistry in general. And so, you come across these things by way of, how do you make a poison? What are the compounds associated with that? How do they interact with the body? How long does it take? And so on. So, yeah, but not so much from tattooing. That's a very easy thing to contend with. If you're going to receive tattoos in prison, you make your own needles and you supply the artist that's doing the work. You make him a machine, you make him the needles, you make the ink yourself, which I did. And then he uses only that with you. But other than that, the risk, like I said, is that the knife being wielded by someone else is laced with poison or other bacteria. That's often done too. I mean, you figure a man is going to keister a weapon to bring it out to the yard. So he's bringing that weapon out of his rectum. And even if he takes steps to cleanse himself, you still have that bacteria. See? And that E. coli is still there, still present. So that the potential when you're stabbed with that is enormous. It's not something that you think about. Oh, geez, is that dookie I see on that guy's knife blade? These aren't things that occur to you. You don't concern yourself with it. Your focus is on the fight itself and defeating your enemy.
There was a story in the Arizona prison system where a guy had murdered a sex offender and the AB offered him the patch and he told them to F themselves. And then he was eating a sandwich in the chow hall and there was a needle put in it that was laced with blood infected with hepatitis C. Is that what you mean by poison?
That would be one way, yes. Where you take, where an individual has hep C or AIDS, or any other form of disease for that matter, and that can be cultured. A petri dish is not that difficult to make. The medium that you use in that is not that. It really doesn't even need a medium, to be honest with you. I mean, you can use distilled water. Excuse me, but I used to grow so many things in my cell that staff would refuse to come in. I mean, some of the molds and fungi, that I would grow, I mean, they would be a foot tall. And I had many, many different science projects in my cell. And so it, I couldn't, I was pursuing biology and I couldn't work in the field. To do my lab work, I had to synthesize the field studies of other biologists, and I did that. But, there's still that within you, particularly when you're, in my case, when you're studying biology, that, you want to experience yourself. I didn't have a microscope. It would have been marvelous to have a microscope. Microscopy is fascinating because it opens up an entirely different world. Then you get into quantum physics itself, as it relates to the micro world, and that which we don't see and that which influences the macro world. So there you're getting into good Albert Einstein and Max Planck, and the diverging theories there relative to quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity. But that's going in an entirely different direction, and it's kind of boring. But you get the point.
Dirtman wants to know, were the hospitals in prison efficient or not?
New Miller Hospital in San Quentin, I'll never forget this, was absolutely phenomenal. What would happen is that, you had the Vietnam War going on, and so then you had the end of the Vietnam War, and then all those doctors and nurses that were performing triage in Vietnam came to work at New Miller Hospital in San Quentin. So the interesting thing about it is that people knew that, say you were in a knife fight, those knife fights actually became more brutal, because if the individual didn't die on the spot and they were able to get to him and put him on a gurney and get him to New Miller Hospital, that triage team could save him, and oftentimes did. And so absolutely phenomenal. Now at Old Folsom, it was an entirely different thing. I mean, I was shot a number of times. They'd take you in, they'd probe the wound. If it didn't hit anything vital, they'd patch you up, send you back to your cell. And, it's San Quentin, there really was. And I took 5 rounds from a shotgun there, and hundreds and hundreds of shot in my body. And, the doctor told me that had I not had the muscle mass on my back, that's where I was shot, is in the back, that it would have punctured my lungs and punctured my heart. But the point is that he was able to triage me, because my back was hamburger. It was just a bloody mess. But he was able to triage me, and, he told me a lot of the shot would come out, but that a lot of it would stay and encapsulate with scar tissue, and it has to this day. It when they take an X-ray of me, that you see all that shot in me.
What was the pain like from receiving that gunshot?
The pain wasn't so bad as it relates to receiving the shot entering your body. What was bad was that the shot was red hot as a result of, coming through that barrel. A shotgun doesn't have any rifling in it. So it just comes straight through that barrel, and it's on fire. And it hits your back and it enters your body, and that's the first thing you feel is the heat from that lead shot burning you.
Wow. This is probably going to be the last question. A huge thank you, everyone. JC, running the risk of sounding naive, upon hearing about your color blindness, have you ever tried psychedelics?
I haven't. Although it's a great question. I had an association with Timothy Leary back in the 60s, and he was a huge advocate of lysergic acid. And I used to watch him and others trip. But and some would use mushrooms, and I've seen people use both in prison too. But I am too much of a control freak, I suppose, is the proper term. I do not like not being in control of my faculties.
Hold on a minute. I read Timothy Leary's jail notes. So are you saying that you did time with Leary, or this was before, or?
This was in the 60s. Yeah. So no, I didn't go to prison till the early 70s, but
Okay.
he lived on Woodland Canyon Drive in Laguna Canyon, just off from Laguna Beach. And my oldest ranch used to be just over the mountain from that. So I oftentimes used to ride, when I bring the cattle over the mountain into the lower pastures, I would ride into those areas, and had many encounters with Timothy and his friends, and brilliant man, way over my head, particularly back then. But I was taught, and I still believe to this day, that listening is a gift. So I just simply listened.
What about Ken Casey?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. So we're coming up to 2 hours. Huge thank you to Mike and everyone who's sent questions in. We've tried to get through as many of them as possible, and this is what happens every time we do this. We're just inundated with so many questions. there's not enough time to work through them all. I know there's still tons in the chat. There's still tons in my Microsoft Word document. And, perhaps if Mike wants to keep this series going, we could get around to those at some point in the future. But in the meantime, go to his channel and ask him questions on his channel. Post them on his comments. Subscribe to his channel. I've just put the link in the live chat, wherever you are watching this. And Mike's now done 5 podcasts with us, at least 2 hours each, 10 hours. This has been, definitely some of the most interesting stories we've ever had on this channel. But I'm sure he's going to be posting tons of stories on his own channel here in the coming months. So you will be the first to receive them if you subscribe to his channel. So huge thank you, my friend.
Well, you're welcome. And let me say this. I mean, my podcast aside, don't you hesitate to invite me back on. I enjoy this. I think it has value. And I appreciate the questions. I appreciate your viewers taking the time to ask the questions. And, eventually maybe we'll get them all answered.
That will be fantastic. I'm going to be going on the road this week for a couple of weeks, but I'll be back for Christmas, so perhaps we could do some Christmas Q&A special.
All right, let's plan on it.
All right, take care out there wherever you are in the world. Much love and respect. Thank you for watching, and Mike's links are in the description box below this video. Also, for people who are going to be listening to this on the audio platforms, can you just tell them the name of your channel, Mike, so they can find it for themselves?
It's Thoughts and Observations with Michael Thompson.
All right. Cheers. So if you're on the audio platform, Spotify or iTunes, go and find that on Google and check it out. Take care out there. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Cheers.